Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know why you're here, to get to the bottom of things. And today,
To be smart.
yeah, to get smart fast,
Yeah.
to learn some stuff. And today we're tackling a really big question. Are biological systems inherently more intelligent than AI?
And yes, so why?
Why? Right. And so you sent over a really fascinating paper called Are Biological Systems More Intelligent Than Artificial Intelligence? Really gets to the heart of this question.
Yeah, this paper moves beyond just looking at, performance on particular tasks,
Right.
and instead asks a deeper question about like what intelligence even is.
Right. And how do you even measure intelligence?
Yeah.
We've come through this research, and our mission today is to really unpack the key ideas around adaptability. That's what the authors identify as like the core of intelligence. We'll be comparing how this plays out in, living things versus artificial intelligence, and we'll highlight some really surprising findings along the way. So let's just dive right in. Right off the bat, the paper defines intelligence in a way that you might not expect.
Yeah. The really interesting thing here is that they define intelligence as adaptability.
Okay.
And more specifically, how efficiently a system learns cause and effect.
Okay.
So if you think about it,
Yeah.
if you can understand what causes something, you can then change your behavior to get what you want.
Right.
And they actually measure this efficiency by two things. One is how much data a system needs to learn something, and the other is how much energy it takes.
Which makes you immediately think, like, right now, AI needs tons and tons of data.
Mountains of data.
Yeah, and tons of energy to do things that we think are pretty basic.
Yeah. And I think this gets to one of the core points of the paper, which is that contemporary AI requires, massive amounts of data and energy to learn tasks that humans can learn from very few examples.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, and it's a huge difference in efficiency,
Yeah.
right? And they talk about this really cool example. I don't know if you saw this in the paper, where they had an organoid. So this is like a tiny collection of cells grown in a lab playing Pong, and it beat the AI.
That's wild.
I know.
It's a great example.
And it learned way faster with less data.
It is striking. But I think it's important to note that the researchers point out that in those types of experiments, there are human-imposed boundary conditions.
Right.
So the organoid isn't just playing Pong out in the wild.
Yeah, it's not just like a wild organoid, right? Like you said, it's very carefully constructed, the environment, how it interacts, all that stuff.
Yeah, totally.
But it still makes you wonder, like, what's going on at a basic level with biological systems that allows them to adapt so efficiently?
Yeah, and I think it raises the question of what is biological intelligence. And the paper does talk about existing ideas
Right.
about biological intelligence,
Yeah.
things like active inference. This is the idea that living things are always trying to predict what's going to happen next and then minimize surprise
Right.
and then strong inductive bias.
Yeah.
This is the idea that we're kind of born with certain assumptions
Yeah.
that allow us to learn quickly.
Okay, so these are some current theories. But the authors believe there's more to the picture.
Right? They don't think those tell the whole story.
Yeah, so they introduced this really interesting concept. It's called the multi-scale competency architecture, or MCA for short. So we've seen this efficiency gap, right? What's their explanation?
So the thing about MCA that I think is so interesting is that it is a fundamental way that biological systems organize themselves. And the key insight is that adaptation isn't just happening in one place like the brain.
Okay.
It's happening at every scale,
Whoa.
from individual cells all the way up to organs, organisms, and even ecosystems.
So it's like adaptability built in at every layer.
Yeah, and it's kind of a,
Oh, and they say it's scale-free. They compare it to the Barnsley fern fractal. Can you explain that? What's that connection?
yeah, so imagine you have this Barnsley fern,
Okay.
and you zoom in on any part of it, you see the same fern-like shape repeating over and over again.
Okay, yeah.
And so the scale-free nature of MCA means that similar adaptive processes, this ability to learn and respond,
Yeah.
are happening at all of these different levels.
I like that. That visual really helps.
Yeah.
So instead of having a central command center, like a computer, how does control work in these biological systems with this MCA?
That's a key difference.
Hmm.
So in biological systems, control is largely delegated. Cells have a degree of independence.
Okay.
They can act to achieve their own goals while also working together and forming larger groups.
Right.
And these groups can sense and act on a wider range of things.
I see.
So it's more of a bottom-up approach
Okay.
to control, though, of course, there are also top-down influences.
Right.
And they're inactive.
So they learn by doing.
Yeah, they learn and adapt through their interactions with the world around them.
So each cell has like some level of agency. It's like contributing to the bigger picture. And this leads to the paper's central claim, which they admit is a bit unexpected. Biological systems are inherently more intelligent because they delegate control all the way down to the most basic levels. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is a strong
Yeah.
statement. And so to understand what they mean by this delegation to the lowest level of abstraction, we first need to understand what abstraction itself means in this context.
Right, let's unpack abstraction in like a biological sense. What are we even talking about?
So they define abstraction as the process by which increasingly complex behaviors arise from simpler, goal-directed behaviors at lower levels.
Okay.
So think of it like building blocks.
Okay.
Cells with their basic functions combine to form tissues. Tissues form organs with more complex functions, and then organs work together to create the behavior of the organism.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So language, using tools, these are examples of higher levels of abstraction built on simpler foundations,
Right.
basically.
So when we look at a system at a lower level of abstraction in biology, we're looking at smaller, simpler parts like cells. But in a computer, it's not quite the same when we go lower in the system.
Right, because in a computer going lower in the abstraction stack,
Yeah.
like going from a software program down to the operating system, down to the actual hardware, that doesn't necessarily mean you're looking at like independently acting parts that form some kind of collective.
Right.
Part of the operating system that handles memory.
Yeah.
Doesn't have like its own goals
Right.
in the same way that a cell trying to survive and replicate does.
Right. So delegated control isn't just about like assigning tasks. It's about giving actual independence to these lower levels.
Totally.
Right. So can you contrast like how control is delegated in biological systems versus computational systems a little more directly?
Yeah, so biological systems have this bottom-up control where individual components, like cells,
Yeah.
can behave with a degree of autonomy.
Okay.
They have their own agendas within certain constraints.
Right.
And the collective of those actions leads to the behavior of the larger system.
Okay.
Computational systems typically have top-down control. Even if you delegate tasks to like a specialized processor, like a GPU,
Mm-hmm.
the GPU can't just suddenly decide to do something else.
Right.
If it's removed from that main system, it needs those instructions.
Right.
The paper uses a really great analogy here. They compare a centrally planned economy, where decisions are made at the top, to a decentralized one,
Right.
where individuals have more freedom to make decisions.
Right.
Biological systems are much more like that decentralized model.
I like that. That analogy really makes it clear. So why is this delegation of control down to the lowest levels so advantageous for adaptation, for this intelligence they're talking about?
They argue that when the ability to adapt exists at those lower levels of abstraction, the system becomes much more specialized and efficient.
Okay.
They actually use an analogy from computer programming here.
Okay.
So writing code directly in a lower level language like C
Yeah.
allows for finer control and better optimization for a specific hardware compared to a higher level language like Python.
Yeah.
Or similarly, programming directly at the hardware level using something like an FPGA can be even more efficient for certain tasks than running compiled code on a general purpose CPU.
Right, because each added layer of abstraction takes you further away from the ground truth, the actual physical reality that the system has to adapt to.
Totally.
Right, like software ultimately is just a particular configuration of the hardware.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and the paper also brings up this idea of graceful degradation in distributed systems, like a swarm of drones.
Yeah. Okay.
So if control is centralized and one leader drone,
Yeah.
the whole system might fail if that leader is compromised. But if you have delegated control,
Okay.
the swarm can often continue to function.
Even if some are lost.
Yeah, even if you lose a few drones.
Right. That makes sense. It's like built-in resilience at every level. And the paper brings up a cool real-world example with this military concept called mission command.
Yeah, so this is the idea of empowering lower-level units to adapt to the specific situation
Right.
and even bend the rules if it serves the objective.
Right.
And they give the example of the Nordbat II peacekeeping force in Bosnia
Yeah.
as an example of how that led to effectiveness in a complex environment.
Right. So this ability to adapt is really tied to learning cause and effect. How does the paper explain this in like a computational way?
Yeah, so adaptation at its heart requires learning what actions lead to what outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And so systems can interact with the environment and essentially experiment to build a mental model of cause and effect,
Okay.
what they call a causal graph. And the paper discusses two primary ways a system can do this. One is it can assume the basic components and learn the relationships between them, or it can assume the relationships and learn what the components are.
Okay.
And they argue that biological systems tend to lean more towards the latter.
Okay.
And they call this valence.
Okay, so how does this connect to like a computer program or a policy, like the set of rules that guide a system's behavior?
Yeah, they frame causal learning in computational terms by suggesting that figuring out the nodes in the causal graph is like figuring out which computer program could have generated a particular history of inputs and outputs.
Okay.
The challenge, though, is that there could be many different policies that could explain the same past behavior,
Right.
but they might predict very different outcomes in the future.
Okay, so how do you determine which policy is the most likely cause?
Right, and it's not just about which program seems simpler.
Okay.
They argue that focusing solely on simplicity can be misleading. Instead, they propose comparing policies based on their function, how they behave when you give them new inputs.
Okay.
They say that adaptive systems need to satisfy certain functional requirements. And here's a key insight. If two different policies can explain past observations equally well, the one that is more likely to have generated the behavior is the weaker one.
Weaker meaning.
Less specific, more general.
Okay.
So a weaker policy places fewer constraints on future behavior.
Gotcha.
It allows for a wider range of possibilities.
Okay.
And they call this process of favoring weaker policies weak policy optimization, or WPO.
Okay.
And they have mathematical proofs in the appendix showing that this is both necessary and sufficient for maximizing the chances that the system will be able to generalize, which is really key for adaptability.
So current machine learning systems, they don't typically prioritize this weak policy optimization.
Right.
And maybe that explains why they need so much data to learn.
Yeah, and I think this is a huge part of their argument. Even when AI systems are designed with principles of simplicity in mind,
Okay.
their ability to optimize for this kind of weakness is fundamentally limited by their abstraction layer,
Hmm.
that interface between the software intelligence and the physical environment.
Okay.
It's like a causal filter.
Right.
And different abstraction layers impose different constraints on how weak a policy can be,
Okay.
and therefore on the potential for truly embodied intelligence. They have a great line here. They say intelligence is primarily determined by the underlying structure, the hardware,
Okay.
and not just by the algorithms or the software.
So choosing the right abstraction layer is critical.
Totally.
Right. An intelligent choice helps to narrow down all that information in the real world
Right.
to just what's relevant
Yeah.
for the task at hand.
And they use this analogy of a tool to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So a very specialized tool
Mhm.
can only perform a narrow set of tasks,
Right.
whereas a less specialized, weaker tool, like a general-purpose knife, can be used for a much wider variety of purposes.
Yeah.
And they argue that biological systems can embody these weaker policies more readily than AI
Okay.
because they can move their abstraction layer, they can optimize the system at those lower levels
Okay.
to support broader capabilities.
But a typical computer system, those lower levels are fixed.
Yeah.
Right.
That window through which the AI interacts is static.
Right. And so this static abstraction layer in computers ultimately limits their adaptability because
Right.
they can't embody those weaker, more general policies
Right.
that would allow them to handle a wider range of situations.
Exactly.
Okay, so this all really ties back to their idea of the multi-scale competency architecture.
It does.
Right. So how do all of these concepts kind of come together?
Yeah, so the MCA is this hierarchical structure
Right.
of abstraction layers, but with a key difference.
Yeah.
Adaptation,
Yeah.
driven by this weak policy optimization,
Yeah.
is happening at every level,
Yeah.
and control is delegated downwards.
Okay.
And they introduced this formal framework called pan-computational inactivism
Okay.
to describe this.
So it's less about the blueprint and more about what it actually does.
Right, it's less about analyzing what the system is
Yeah.
and more about what it does.
Right. Okay.
Its behaviors, its programs.
Yeah.
And I think that's key to understanding biological intelligence.
Okay.
This focus on what systems do
Mm.
rather than what they are.
Right.
So they talk about V-tasks
Okay.
as these challenges a system needs to solve,
Okay.
defined by its vocabulary, which represents its current abstraction layer.
So it's almost like a universal language for comparing biological and artificial systems.
Right, it's about comparing capabilities.
Yeah.
And they use this formal lens to explain how a vocabulary can describe a distributed system like an organ,
Okay.
which is made up of many cells. And the overall behavior of the organ emerges from those individual behaviors of the cells, which ideally are operating with a relatively weak policy.
So the weaker those policies at the cell level, the more likely the whole organ will be able to function effectively.
Yeah, the weaker policies are more likely to be general enough to be useful across a range of situations.
Right. Okay.
So the parts are more likely to be able to contribute to that successful collective behavior if their own rules are flexible.
Gotcha.
And so a sufficiently weak policy at the cell level is necessary for that collective to have a coherent identity.
So it's this interconnected chain or stack of abstraction that allows for this multi-scale adaptability.
Exactly.
And from this perspective, even a human being is something that our cells do rather than just a collection of cells.
Right. These
Okay.
complex behaviors we observe our ability to think, to move, to interact.
Yeah.
These are emergent properties arising from this system.
Right.
And they use the analogy of an organ as a kind of policy running on the hardware of the cells. But the difference is that in biological systems,
Yeah.
that hardware layer, the cells themselves are also adaptive and can adjust their own policies
Right.
to support the functions at higher levels.
But in a computer, those are typically fixed.
Right. Human-engineered abstraction layers, like the instruction set architecture, are typically fixed.
It's like the human level that designed it is disconnected.
Yeah, it's intervened in the stack.
Right. And so this intervention, the static layer in computers, limits the potential for weak policy optimization.
Yes.
Right. Because the lower levels can't adapt
It can't change.
to support the needs of the higher level goals.
Exactly.
Right.
And so the paper introduces this idea of a function they call F,
Okay.
which translates a collective policy into a new vocabulary for the next level of abstraction. And then they describe a series of uninstantiated tasks at each level, representing the pressures
Right.
acting on the system.
Okay.
And the definition of correct becomes more specific as you move up the stack. And their Theorem 3 shows that the ability to adapt effectively at higher levels
Yeah.
depends on the ability to adapt at the lower level.
So when we create computers, we're taking a slice of our own abstract capabilities
Right.
and encoding them into this fixed set of instructions.
Yeah, a fixed set of instructions.
Right. So it might be able to mimic high-level intelligence, but it doesn't have that adaptability at the foundation.
Totally. And the ISA,
Yeah.
while being capable of performing any computable task in theory,
Yeah.
it doesn't have that adaptive system at its core.
Right.
That's why we often see the need for things like specialized hardware like FPGAs
Right.
as an attempt to regain some of that lower level flexibility.
So the static IS is like having a fixed window.
Yeah, and an MCA can adjust its window.
Yeah. To get a better view,
Yeah, to get a better view.
to get a better utility.
Right, a better utility for the task at hand. And their proof 3 really drives this home.
Okay, so this is a really clear picture of why biological systems might be more adaptable. But are there any downsides to this constant self-organization and delegated control?
That's a great question.
Right. Because they do briefly mention the analogy of cancer.
Yeah, so they acknowledge that this distributed bottom-up control can have drawbacks.
Right.
And the analogy to cancer is really useful here.
Right.
So when cells become isolated,
Yeah.
they can lose their higher level identity and revert to more basic behaviors like uncontrolled growth.
So it's like they stop following the rules
Right.
that are for the well-being of the organism.
Yeah. And in more formal terms, this is like the system becoming over-constrained,
Okay.
where no collective policy can be maintained,
Yeah.
but the components still can act independently.
So this over-constraint can come from tasks that are too hard or from too much top-down control.
Right.
Okay.
And if a change in policy at a lower level makes it impossible to achieve a higher level policy,
Yeah.
parts of the system might splinter off
Right.
to loosen those constraints, isolating themselves from the collective.
Yeah.
Exactly like cancer. So they argue that systems might actually need to be a bit under-constrained
Okay.
to allow for graceful degradation, flexibility,
Yeah.
so they can maintain functionality even in unexpected situations.
Okay. And distributed control, like we see in swarm intelligence, reduces that risk of failure.
Yeah, and also reduces the incentive for individual parts to break away
Right.
because they don't really gain an advantage by doing so.
So just to kind of quickly summarize the core argument, biological systems, with their multi-scale competency architectures,
Yeah,
they're essentially stacks of abstraction layers
right.
where adaptability is delegated and increasingly decentralized as you go down.
Yeah,
They optimize for weaker, more general policies, which are the best way to approximate causality.
that's right.
And critically, the ability to adapt at higher levels depends on the capacity for adaptation at those lower levels. That's this multi-layer causal learning idea. Right. And so the paper argues that The adaptability we see in biological systems arises from this ability to delegate adaptation all the way down, which is in contrast to the rigid, human-engineered abstraction stacks we find in AI.
That's right. And they conclude that for truly adaptable systems, control should be delegated to the greatest extent possible
Okay.
while still maintaining the desired functionality at the higher levels.
Right, so it's like a
Yeah,
balance
it's a balance.
of freedom and constraints.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And they even suggest that we should focus on what they call subtractive solutions. So removing unnecessary constraints
Okay.
rather than always trying to add more complexity.
So less is more.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They point to things like federated learning and more biologically inspired AGI designs as potentially fruitful directions.
Right. And they talk about some really interesting future research avenues, right? Like connecting these ideas with other frameworks in cognitive science and neuroscience, how we might design new kinds of adaptive hardware.
Yeah, all kinds of things. And then there's the implications for things like human organizations,
Yeah.
economic systems.
Right.
That was really interesting too.
And that brief discussion about AI regulation and philosophy of mind, I thought that was really interesting too.
Totally. So the idea of being cautious about over-constraining highly autonomous systems
Yeah.
and the idea that creating fixed abstraction layers might disconnect our concepts from their original embodied grounding.
Yeah.
Those are really important ideas.
Yeah. And they conclude by emphasizing that all living abstractions are goal-directed.
Right.
Right. And that purely representational content without that drive might only exist in the layers that we engineer.
That's right.
Wow. Well, this has been a really incredible deep dive. Thank you so much for guiding us through this research.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored this research that suggests a profound difference in how biological systems and AI handle adaptation. And this idea of delegated control and multi-scale architectures, I think, is really crucial to understanding that difference. Now, for a final thought for you to consider. Could a deeper understanding of these biological principles inspire new approaches to creating truly adaptable and robust AI? Maybe moving beyond our current reliance on those static, human-designed architectures. What would it mean to design robots that are inherently more flexible and adaptable? What are the safety considerations for future AI systems that could potentially exhibit these kinds of capabilities?